The hunger gnawed at Ruby Price's belly as she slipped between the crowded stalls of Pignon's bustling market. Her once fine dress now threadbare and dusty from weeks on the road. Arizona Territory, 1878, a place where desperation could drive even the most honest souls to desperate measures, and Ruby had reached her breaking point. The blistering sun beat down on the small frontier town as Ruby's trembling fingers closed around a loaf of bread at the baker's stall. The shopkeeper's back was turned as he attended to a wealthy customer, giving her the moment she needed. With practiced stealth born of recent necessity, she slid the bread into the folds of her shawl and began to back away, her heart pounding like a steam engine in her chest. "Thief!" The baker's voice shattered the market's din. "Someone stop that woman!" Ruby bolted, weaving through the crowd, but her weakened state betrayed her. A firm hand clasped her shoulder before she'd made it 10 paces. The town deputy, a stern-faced man with a neatly trimmed mustache, gripped her arm as the baker caught up, red-faced and furious. "Been having trouble with thieves all month," the deputy said, examining Ruby's gaunt face. "Looks like we caught one." Ruby's voice cracked, her cheeks burning with shame. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." The deputy's expression remained unmoved. "That's what the jail's for, miss. 3 meals a day while you await the judge." As the deputy led her down the main street toward the jailhouse, Ruby felt the stares of townsfolk burning into her. 2 years ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Boston, respected and comfortable. Now, widowed and penniless after her husband's failed mining venture and subsequent death, she was being marched through town like a common criminal. The jailhouse door swung open just as they approached, and a tall figure stepped out into the sunlight. Ruby squinted against the glare to see a man unlike any she'd encountered in Pignon. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a weather-beaten Stetson pulled low over piercing blue eyes. His denim work clothes and leather vest marked him as a working cowboy, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who answered to few men. "What's the trouble, Deputy Adams?" The stranger's deep voice held a hint of Texas drawl. "Caught this one stealing bread from Pearson's bakery," the deputy replied. "Taking her in until Judge Parker makes his monthly visit." The stranger's eyes settled on Ruby, taking in her thin frame, the proud tilt of her chin despite her circumstances, and the unmistakable signs of hunger in her hollow cheeks. "How much for the bread?" he asked quietly. The baker, who had followed them to see justice done, puffed up indignantly. "It ain't just about the bread. It's the principle of the thing. She's a thief. And what's the fine for theft in Pignon these days?" The cowboy's hand moved to his pocket. $5 plus the cost of stolen goods, Deputy Adams recited. "But Mr. Yates, you can't just—" "Wade Yates," the cowboy said, extending his hand to Ruby. "Owner of the Flying Y Ranch outside of town." Ruby stared at his outstretched hand in confusion before cautiously taking it. "Ruby Price." Wade Yates counted out $6 and handed it to the deputy. "That should cover the fine and the bread." His eyes never left Ruby's face as he added, "Next time, Miss Price, just ask me." The deputy reluctantly released Ruby's arm, looking between the two with suspicion. "This isn't how we typically handle thieves in Pignon, Yates." "Then consider it my civic duty to help rehabilitate this particular lawbreaker," Wade replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll take responsibility for her." Ruby bristled despite her circumstances. "I am not some stray dog needing adoption, Mr. Yates." This brought a genuine smile to Wade's face. "No, madam, you certainly are not, but you do look like you could use a decent meal and perhaps employment, if you're willing." He gestured toward a small restaurant across the street. "We can discuss terms over lunch," unless you prefer the deputy's hospitality." Ruby glanced at the jailhouse, then back at the enigmatic cowboy. Everything about this man screamed danger to her carefully guarded heart, yet something in his steady gaze suggested he might be the one person in Pinyon she could trust. "I accept your offer of lunch, Mr. Yates," she said finally, "but nothing more until I hear what employment you're proposing." Wade nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Fair enough." He tipped his hat to the deputy. "We'll be at Emma's if you need to find us." As they crossed the dusty street, Ruby felt the weight of the town's stares. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, yet alongside it bloomed a small spark of hope. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness. Emma's Cafe was a modest establishment with clean gingham curtains and the savory aroma of home cooking. Wade guided Ruby to a corner table and removed his hat, revealing thick chestnut hair that curled slightly at the ends. Up close, Ruby could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years squinting against the Arizona sun. "Order whatever you like," Wade said as Emma herself approached, a plump woman with a kind smile. "Wade Yates, twice in 1 week." "Must be my lucky day," Emma said cheerfully, then turned curious eyes to Ruby. "Miss Price is new to town," Wade said simply. "I'm hoping to convince her to come work at the Flying Y." Ruby ordered beef stew with fresh bread, trying to maintain her dignity despite wanting to devour everything in sight. Once Emma had gone, she leveled her gaze at the cowboy. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Yates? You don't know me." Wade considered her for a moment. "I know hunger when I see it, Miss Price, and desperation. I've been both hungry and desperate in my life." He leaned back in his chair. "The Flying Y is looking for a teacher for the children of my ranch hands. They're good folks, but most never had much schooling themselves. They want better for their children." Ruby's heart quickened. "You're offering me a teaching position, room and board at the ranch, plus $20 a month," Wade confirmed. "There are 12 children aged between 6 and 15. We've converted an old bunkhouse into a schoolhouse. It's not fancy, but it's sturdy." For the first time in months, Ruby felt a flicker of her old self. "I was a teacher in Boston for 3 years before I married." "What brought you to Arizona Territory?" Wade asked as Emma returned with steaming bowls of stew. Ruby hesitated, then decided honesty was the only currency she had left. "My husband Thomas, he heard about silver strikes in the territory. We sold everything to come west. He died of fever 6 months ago near Tucson. The claim was worthless." Wade's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Price." "Thank you." Ruby took a spoonful of stew, closing her eyes briefly at the rich flavor. "After Thomas died, I tried to find teaching positions, but most towns already had teachers or wouldn't hire a woman alone. My money ran out near Prescott, and I've been working my way north since, taking whatever odd jobs I could find." "And how did you end up in Pinyon?" "I heard there was work at the new hotel, but the position was filled when I arrived yesterday." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not a thief, Mr. Yates, or at least I wasn't until today." "Hunger makes criminals of honest people," Wade replied. "The offer stands if you're interested." Ruby studied him, searching for hidden motives. "And where would I stay at this ranch of yours?" "The foreman's house has a spare room. His wife, Sarah, would be glad for the company. Their youngest is 7 and eager to learn her letters." A smile touched Wade's lips. "Sarah's been after me to find a teacher for months." As they finished their meal, Ruby found herself warming to the idea. Teaching again would be a return to normalcy after months of uncertainty. Yet caution held her back. "I'd like to accept your offer, Mr. Yates, but I need to know what's expected of me beyond teaching." Wade's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed in understanding. "Nothing improper, Miss Price. The position is exactly as described, teaching the children, nothing more. I run an honest ranch. Relief flooded through Ruby, followed by embarrassment at having implied otherwise. Forgive me. Recent months have taught me to be wary. No forgiveness needed. Wade signaled to Emma for the bill. The wagon leaves for the Flying Y in an hour. If you have belongings to collect, I can meet you back here. Everything I own is in a small bag at the boarding house, Ruby admitted. I can be ready in half that time. Wade paid for their meal and escorted Ruby to the modest boarding house where she'd spent the previous night. As she gathered her meager possessions, a change of clothes, a worn hairbrush, a faded photograph of her parents, and a small Bible, Ruby allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic for the first time since Thomas's death. Wade was waiting outside with a wagon when she emerged. He helped her climb onto the wooden seat beside him, her small carpet bag tucked securely between them. As the wagon pulled away from Pinyon, Ruby cast a glance back at the town that had nearly been her undoing. "Second thoughts?" Wade asked, noting her backward look. "No," Ruby replied firmly. "No second thoughts. Just wondering how different today might have been if our paths hadn't crossed." Wade's hands were steady on the reins as he guided the team of horses onto the main road heading north. "Life out here is full of such moments, Miss Price. Chance meetings that change everything." The road to the Flying Y wound through stands of ponderosa pines and across rocky plateaus, offering breathtaking views of distant mesas. As they traveled, Wade pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the territory's history. Ruby found herself relaxing in his company, drawn to his quiet strength and unassuming intelligence. "How did you come to own a ranch at your age?" Ruby asked, guessing Wade couldn't be much past 30. A shadow crossed his face. "My father started it. He came west after the war, the real war, he called it, meaning the one between the states. Built it from nothing." Wade paused. "He was killed 3 years ago in a dispute with cattle rustlers. My mother passed a year later, some say from a broken heart, though the doctor called it pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly, recognizing the familiar pain of loss in his voice. Wade nodded in acknowledgement. "It's been a hard road keeping the place going, but we manage. The Flying Y has 20 ranch hands now, most with families. Good people." As the wagon crested a final hill, Ruby caught her first glimpse of the Flying Y ranch spread out below them in a verdant valley. A large 2-story ranch house of hewn logs stood at its center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and smaller houses. Cattle grazed on distant pastures and horses moved about the corral near what must be the stables. "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed. Wade's expression softened with evident pride. "It's home." As they approached, Ruby saw children playing near a long, low building that must be the converted bunkhouse Wade had mentioned. At the sight of the wagon, they came running, followed by several women who had been watching them. "Mr. Wade's back," a small boy shouted, leading the pack. Wade brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and helped Ruby down. Immediately, they were surrounded by curious children and adults alike. "Everyone, this is Miss Ruby Price," Wade announced. "She's agreed to be your new teacher." A tall, kind-faced woman with graying hair stepped forward. "Thank the Lord. I'm Sarah Miller, the foreman's wife." She took Ruby's hands in hers. "These young'uns have been running wilder than jackrabbits without proper schooling. It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Miller," Ruby said, genuinely touched by the warm welcome. "Just Sarah, please. We don't stand on ceremony at the Flying Y." She gestured to the children gathered around. "These are some of your future pupils. My youngest, Beth, is the one hiding behind my skirts." A small girl with auburn braids peeked out shyly, and Ruby bent down to her level. "Hello, Beth. I hear you're eager to learn your letters." Beth nodded solemnly. "Can you teach me to read real books, like Mama does?" "That's exactly why I'm here," Ruby promised. Wade cleared his throat. "Sarah, Miss Price will be staying in your spare room as we discussed." "Everything's ready," Sarah assured him, then turned to Ruby. "Come along, dear. You must be tired after your journey. I'll show you where you'll be staying and you can rest before supper." As Ruby followed Sarah toward a comfortable-looking house nearby, she glanced back to find Wade watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. He tipped his hat when their eyes met, then turned to speak with a man Ruby assumed must be Mr. Miller, the foreman. Sarah's home was simply furnished but cozy, with handmade quilts and curtains adding warmth to the practical frontier dwelling. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. "It's not much," Sarah apologized, "but it's private and yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," Ruby said sincerely, setting her bag on the bed. After months of uncertainty, even this modest room felt like luxury. "Wade told us a bit about your circumstances," Sarah said carefully. "Not details, mind you, just that you'd fallen on hard times after losing your husband. I want you to know you're among friends here." Ruby's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Thank you. Rest a while. Supper's at 6 in the main house. The boss takes meals with the foreman's family and any single workers. Family style, he calls it." Sarah paused at the door. "Wade Yates is a good man, Miss Price. Best I've known. Whatever brought you two together, I'd call it Providence." After Sarah left, Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, overcome by the day's events. That morning, she had awakened hungry and hopeless in a strange town. Now she had a purpose, a roof over her head, and the promise of honest work doing what she loved. As the afternoon light filtered through the simple cotton curtains, Ruby carefully unpacked her few belongings. She changed into her one good dress, faded but clean, and did her best to make herself presentable for supper. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a woman thinner than she'd been in Boston, with shadows under her eyes, but the spark of hope had returned. At precisely 6 o'clock, Ruby made her way to the main ranch house with Sarah and her husband, Robert Miller, a taciturn but kindly man with weathered features and calloused hands. The house's interior surprised Ruby with its comfortable elegance, not ostentatious, but furnished with solid, well-crafted pieces that spoke of permanence and tradition. Wade greeted them in a dining room dominated by a long table that could seat 20. Already seated were several ranch hands, single men who lived in the bunkhouse. Wade introduced Ruby to each one, and she did her best to memorize their names and faces. "Miss Price will begin teaching on Monday," Wade announced as they ate the hearty beef stew and fresh bread prepared by the ranch's cook, a cheerful Mexican woman named Alina. "I expect all the children to attend regularly. Will you be joining us for lessons, Mr. Yates?" Ruby asked impulsively, noticing how the men deferred to him. A few of the cowboys chuckled, but Wade merely raised an eyebrow. "Do you think I need schooling, Miss Price? Everyone can benefit from education," she replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. Wade's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Perhaps I'll sit in occasionally, to set a good example." The conversation flowed easily after that, with the ranch hands eager to tell Ruby about their children and what they hoped they'd learn. By the end of the meal, Ruby had a clearer picture of the community. She joined a tight-knit group bound not just by work, but by mutual respect and shared purpose. After dinner, Wade invited Ruby to tour the schoolhouse by lantern light. The converted bunkhouse was larger than she'd expected, with rows of rough-hewn benches and tables, a blackboard mounted on one wall, and bookshelves containing a surprisingly diverse collection of volumes. Where did all these books come from? Ruby asked, running her fingers along the spines of classics mixed with practical texts on mathematics and geography. My mother was a great believer in education, Wade explained, setting the lantern on a table. She brought many from back east. Others I've acquired over the years whenever I traveled to Prescott or Phoenix. Ruby pulled out a well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe and smiled. This was a favorite of mine as a child. Mine too, Wade admitted. Though out here, the idea of being stranded alone doesn't seem so far-fetched. Ruby replaced the book and turned to face him directly. Mr. Yates, I want to thank you properly for what you did today. You saved me from jail, possibly worse. Wade's expression grew serious in the lantern's golden light. You don't owe me thanks, Miss Price. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, Ruby said softly. Why did you really help me? And don't say it was just because you needed a teacher. Wade was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her face. When I saw you being led away by the deputy, something about your expression reminded me of my mother after my father died. Proud despite everything, refusing to break. He looked away, focusing on the lantern flame. And yes, we did need a teacher. Sarah's been pestering me about it for months. Ruby sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful, and I promise to earn my keep. I have no doubts about that, Miss Price. Wade picked up the lantern. Classes start Monday. That gives you tomorrow to prepare and meet the rest of the children. Sarah will help you with anything you need. As they walked back toward the Miller house in companionable silence, Ruby felt a curious sense of rightness, as if the random, often cruel events of the past year had somehow led her exactly where she needed to be. Good night, Miss Price, Wade said when they reached Sarah's door. Welcome to the Flying Y. Good night, Mr. Yates, Ruby replied, watching as he walked away toward the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the star-filled Arizona sky. The following days passed in a flurry of activity as Ruby prepared for her first day of teaching. Sarah proved an invaluable ally, introducing her to all the ranch families and helping her understand the varied educational backgrounds of her future pupils. Some of the children had attended school before their families came to the Flying Y, while others had never had any formal education. Ruby saw little of Wade during this time. Sarah explained that spring was a busy season on a cattle ranch, with new calves to tend and preparations for the summer drive to market. When their paths did cross, Wade was unfailingly polite but somewhat reserved, as if their conversation in the schoolhouse had crossed some invisible boundary. On Monday morning, Ruby stood nervously before her assembled students, 12 children ranging from Beth Miller at 7 to Frank Donovan, a tall, gangly boy of 15, whose father was one of the senior cowhands. The schoolroom smelled of fresh-cut pine and the wildflowers the Miller girls had gathered to decorate the teacher's desk. Good morning, Ruby began, her teacher's voice returning as naturally as breathing. I'm Miss Price, and I'm very happy to be your teacher. By mid-morning, Ruby had assessed the general knowledge level of each child and divided them into groups based on ability rather than age. Beth and 2 other young children formed the beginners group, while Frank and the older students who had some previous schooling comprised the advanced group. The middle group, with varying levels of basic reading and arithmetic, was the largest. Ruby was so engrossed in helping the beginners with their letters that she didn't notice the schoolhouse door opening shortly before the noon break. Only when Beth looked up with a delighted Mr. Wade did Ruby turn to find the rancher standing just inside the door, his hat in his hands. I hope I'm not interrupting, Wade said. I thought I'd see how the first day was progressing. Not at all, Ruby replied, pleased despite herself at his interest. We were just about to break for lunch. Children, please show Mr. Yates what you've been working on this morning. Eagerly, the students displayed their slates and copybooks. Wade moved among them, offering praise and encouragement to each child in turn. Ruby watched with growing admiration as he crouched beside little Beth, listening intently as she proudly identified the letters she'd learned. "You've accomplished a lot in one morning," Wade commented to Ruby as the children filed out for their lunch break. "They're eager to learn," Ruby said, straightening papers on her desk. "Frank has a natural aptitude for mathematics that's quite impressive. His father will be pleased to hear that. He's hoping Frank might help with the ranch accounts someday." Wade hesitated, then added, "I brought something for the school." From behind his back, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much, but I thought it might be useful." Ruby unwrapped the package to find a beautiful brass bell, its surface polished to a high shine. "For calling the children in from play," Wade explained. "Sarah mentioned you were using a tin cup and spoon." "It's perfect," Ruby said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gift. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual recognition of connection that startled them both. Wade cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should let you enjoy your break," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "Perhaps you'll join us for dinner tonight. Elena is making her famous enchiladas." "I'd like that," Ruby replied, surprised by how much she meant it. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Each weekday, Ruby taught her growing group of students. Word had spread to neighboring small ranches, and 3 more children now made the daily ride to the Flying Y for schooling. Evenings were spent preparing lessons, reading, or joining the communal dinners at the main house where Wade was often present. On Saturdays, Ruby helped Sarah with household tasks and got to know the other women of the Flying Y. Sundays were for rest and the informal church services held in the schoolhouse, led by different ranch members each week. Wade, she learned, had a surprisingly fine singing voice and knew many hymns by heart. As April turned to May, Ruby found herself watching for Wade whenever she ventured outside the schoolhouse, her heart quickening when she caught sight of him working with horses in the corral or conferring with Robert Miller about ranch business. She told herself it was merely gratitude she felt, combined with natural admiration for a man who managed his responsibilities with such quiet competence. One Saturday afternoon, Ruby was hanging laundry with Sarah when Wade rode up to the Miller house, leading a gentle-looking Palomino mare. "Afternoon, ladies," he called, dismounting with fluid grace. "Miss Price, I wondered if you might like to see more of the ranch than just the yard and schoolhouse." Sarah shot Ruby a knowing look that made her blush. "That sounds lovely, Mr. Yates, but I'm afraid I don't ride." "Daisy here is the gentlest horse on the Flying Y," Wade assured her. "Perfect for a beginner." With Sarah's encouragement, Ruby agreed. Wade helped her mount, his strong hands at her waist sending an unexpected thrill through her body. He showed her how to hold the reins and gave basic instructions before mounting his own horse, a powerful black gelding named Shadow. They rode at a walking pace away from the ranch buildings, Wade patiently teaching Ruby the basics of horsemanship. Gradually, her initial nervousness faded, replaced by delight at the mare's responsive nature and the breathtaking beauty of the land. Wade led her to a ridge overlooking the entire Flying Y, spread thousands of acres of grazing land, forests, and a winding creek that caught the afternoon sunlight like a ribbon of gold. "It's magnificent," Ruby said as they dismounted to rest the horses. Your father chose well when he settled here. He used to say the land spoke to him, Wade replied, leaning against a ponderosa pine. Told him this was where he belonged. Ruby sat on a sun-warmed rock, arranging her skirts modestly. And you, does it speak to you as well? Wade's gaze swept over the valley below, his expression softening. Every day. I can't imagine being anywhere else. He glanced at her curiously. Do you miss the East? Boston must have been very different. It was, Ruby acknowledged. But there's a raw beauty here that Boston lacks. An honesty to the landscape. She hesitated, then added, after Thomas died, I thought I'd go back east eventually, but now. Now, Wade prompted when she didn't continue. Ruby met his eyes directly. Now I'm not so sure that's what I want anymore. Something shifted in Wade's expression, a guardedness giving way to possibility. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Robert Miller and two ranch hands appeared over the ridge, their expressions urgent. Boss, been looking for you, Miller called. Telegram from Pearson in Pinyon. That cattle buyer from Kansas City will be here Monday instead of next week. Wade's expression immediately shifted to focused concern. That changes things. We'll need to gather the herd we selected for him by tomorrow night. He turned apologetically to Ruby. I'm afraid we'll have to cut our ride short, Miss Price. Of course, Ruby said, trying to hide her disappointment. The ride back to the ranch was hurried, with Wade and the men discussing logistics while Ruby concentrated on staying balanced on Daisy. The peaceful intimacy of their earlier conversation was lost amid the pressing business concerns. Upon returning to the ranch, activity had already increased as word spread about the buyer's early arrival. Wade helped Ruby dismount, his touch briefer this time, his mind clearly already on the task ahead. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Yates, Ruby said formally, sensing his distraction. Wade's attention returned to her for a moment, and he smiled genuinely. It was my pleasure, Miss Price. Rain check on the rest of the tour. I'd like that, Ruby replied, watching as he strode away to organize his men for the cattle gathering. The next day was Sunday, but there were no services. Every available man was out bringing in cattle from the far pastures, including Wade, who had ridden out before dawn. Ruby spent the day helping the women prepare food for the returning cowboys and keeping the children occupied and out of the way. It was near midnight when the men finally returned, dusty, exhausted, but successful. The selected cattle were now corralled near the ranch, ready for the buyer's inspection. Ruby, still awake and helping Alina serve hot coffee and food to the returning cowboys, caught sight of Wade as he entered the main house. He looked bone-weary, his clothes coated with dust, but he smiled when he saw her. You're still up, he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. You didn't have to wait. I wanted to help, Ruby replied simply. You all must be exhausted. Wade took a long drink of the coffee, some color returning to his face. It's part of ranch life, unpredictable. Will everything be ready for the buyer tomorrow? It will. Wade set down his empty cup. The herd looks good. Pearson says this buyer pays fair prices and doesn't try to cheat. Should be a good sale for the Flying Y. Ruby found herself studying his face, the strong lines now softened by fatigue, the usual alertness in his eyes dimmed by exhaustion. On impulse, she reached out and brushed a smudge of dirt from his cheek, the gesture surprisingly intimate. Wade went still under her touch, his eyes meeting hers with sudden intensity. For a heartbeat, Ruby thought he might lean toward her, but Alina entered the room with a fresh pot of coffee, breaking the moment. You should get some rest, Ruby said, stepping back. Tomorrow will be another busy day. Wade nodded, his expression unreadable. Good night, Miss Price. Good night, Mr. Yates. The following days were consumed by the cattle sale. The buyer, a corpulent man named Hargrove, arrived with his own cowboys to help drive the cattle back to the railroad at Prescott. The negotiations took place in Wade's office, but the tension was felt throughout the ranch as everyone understood how important the sale was to the Flying Yates finances. When the buyer finally departed 3 days later, with a signed contract and the cattle already being moved south, the entire ranch celebrated. Wade hosted a special dinner for everyone, with music and dancing afterward in the cleared main room of the ranch house. Ruby, wearing her one good dress freshened with a borrowed ribbon from Sarah, found herself swept into the festivities. She hadn't danced since Thomas's death, but when Frank Donovan's father asked her for a reel, she couldn't refuse. Soon she was laughing as she was passed from partner to partner, the infectious joy of the celebration washing away the last of her reserve. It was nearing 10 o'clock when Wade finally approached her, extending his hand as the musicians began a waltz. "May I have this dance, Miss Price?" Ruby placed her hand in his, her pulse quickening at the contact. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Yates." Wade was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her smoothly around the floor with just the right pressure at her waist. Ruby was acutely aware of his closeness, the clean scent of soap and the faint aroma of leather that seemed uniquely his. "The sale went well?" she asked, needing to break the charged silence between them. "Better than expected," Wade replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Hargrove paid top dollar and wants first option on our fall herd as well. That's wonderful news. It means security for everyone at the Flying Y for another year." His eyes met hers with unexpected vulnerability. "When my father died, many said I was too young to manage a spread this size. That I'd lose everything he'd built." "They underestimated you," Ruby said softly. Wade's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I couldn't bear to fail him, or the people who depend on the Flying Y for their livelihoods." "You haven't failed anyone, Wade," Ruby said, using his first name without thinking. His eyes darkened at the sound of his name on her lips, and he drew her imperceptibly closer as they continued to waltz. "May I call you Ruby? Please do." They danced in silence after that, the music weaving around them like a spell, separating them from the crowded room. When the waltz ended, Wade didn't immediately release her hand. "Would you walk outside with me? The night is pleasant and it's rather warm in here." Ruby nodded, and Wade led her through the French doors onto the wide veranda that wrapped around the ranch house. The May night was indeed pleasant, with a 3/4 moon illuminating the yard and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. They stood at the railing, watching the stars in companionable silence for several minutes before Wade spoke. "I've been wanting to speak with you privately, Ruby, about the future." Ruby's heart quickened. "Oh," Wade turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Your teaching has transformed this place. The children are thriving. Their parents see the difference every day. Thank you. It's been a joy to teach them. I know we agreed to a position through the summer, but I'd like to offer you something more permanent. The Flying Y needs a teacher for the long term." Wade hesitated, then added, "And I find that I've grown accustomed to seeing you at dinner each night." Ruby studied his face, trying to decipher his meaning. "Are you offering me an extended teaching contract, Wade?" A smile touched his lips. "That's part of it, but I find myself hoping for something more personal as well." He took her hand gently in his. "I've come to care for you, Ruby, more than I expected to when I paid that fine in Pinion." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. "Wade," the veranda door opened, spilling light and music into their private moment. Robert Miller stepped out, his expression apologetic when he saw them. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but there's a problem with one of Hargrove's men. He's drunk and threatening Ernesto over a poker game." Wade's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll handle it." He turned back to Ruby. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow." "Yes," Ruby promised, her mind whirling with the implications of his words. Wade squeezed her hand once before following Miller back inside. Ruby remained on the veranda, her thoughts and emotions in turmoil. Wade Yates cared for her. The realization filled her with unexpected joy, but also trepidation. She had not expected to find love again after Thomas, certainly not with a man as different from her late husband as Wade was. Thomas had been scholarly, cautious, full of dreams but lacking the practical skills to achieve them. Wade was solid, capable, rooted to his land in a way Thomas never could have been. Ruby had loved her husband, but their marriage had been based on shared intellectual interests and compatible temperaments rather than passion. What she felt for Wade was altogether different, a complex blend of admiration, gratitude, and a physical awareness that took her breath away when he was near. It both excited and frightened her. Ruby was still lost in these thoughts when Sarah Miller joined her on the veranda. "There you are," Sarah said warmly. "I saw Wade go back inside with Robert. Everything all right, just some trouble with one of the buyer's men," Ruby explained. "Wade went to sort it out." Sarah nodded knowingly. "He's good at handling trouble, firm but fair, just like his father was." She gave Ruby a sidelong glance. "Wade seems different since you came to the Flying Y, lighter somehow." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't know about that." "I do," Sarah said confidently. "I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. The responsibility of the ranch has weighed heavy on him these past 3 years. It's good to see him smiling again." She patted Ruby's hand. "Whatever's growing between you two, I'm glad of it." Before Ruby could formulate a response, shouting erupted from inside the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Sarah and Ruby froze for an instant, then rushed toward the door. Inside was chaos. The musicians had stopped playing and people were pressed against the walls. In the center of the room, Wade stood facing a red-faced cowboy who was being restrained by 2 of the Flying Y hands. A pistol lay on the floor between them. "Take him to the bunkhouse and sober him up," Wade was saying calmly. "He can ride out with Hargrove's men in the morning." As the drunken cowboy was led away, still hurling slurred insults, Ruby pushed through the crowd to Wade's side. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Wade assured her, though she noticed he was holding his left arm oddly. "The fool fired into the ceiling when we tried to disarm him." "You're bleeding," Ruby said, spotting a dark stain on his shirt sleeve. Wade glanced down with mild surprise. "It's just a graze from when we struggled for the gun. Nothing serious." "Let me see," Ruby insisted, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. The celebration effectively over, the ranch hands and their families began to disperse, as Wade allowed Ruby to lead him to his office at the back of the house. Alina appeared with a basin of water and clean cloths, then tactfully withdrew, closing the door behind her. "Take off your shirt," Ruby instructed, rolling up her sleeves. Wade raised an eyebrow but complied, unbuttoning his shirt to reveal a lean, muscled torso marked with old scars testament to years of hard ranch work. Ruby tried to maintain a professional demeanor as she examined the fresh wound on his upper arm. "It's not deep," she confirmed, cleaning the cut carefully, "but it should be bandaged." "I've had worse from tangling with barbed wire," Wade said, watching her work with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "That doesn't make it any less in need of attention," Ruby replied, applying a clean bandage. "There. Try not to use that arm too much for a day or 2. "Yes, madam," Wade said with a hint of amusement. Then, more seriously, "Thank you, Ruby." She became acutely aware of their proximity, the intimacy of the moment heightened by his state of undress and the closed door. "I should go," she said, stepping back. "It's late." Wade caught her hand. "What I was trying to say earlier before we were interrupted." He took a deep breath. "I haven't felt this way about anyone since before my father died. Maybe never." Ruby's heart hammered in her chest. "Wade, I care for you too, more than I thought possible after losing Thomas. But it's all happening so fast." "We don't need to rush," Wade assured her. "I just wanted you to know how I feel, how important you've become to me." Ruby looked into his earnest blue eyes and found herself smiling. "When you paid that fine in Pinyon, I thought you were just being charitable." "I never imagined." "Neither did I," Wade admitted. "But now I can't imagine the flying Y without you or my life without you in it." Impulsively, Ruby leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Wade responded immediately, his right arm circling her waist to draw her closer as the kiss deepened, becoming something warm and profound that seemed to answer questions Ruby hadn't even known to ask. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly. Wade rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "I should walk you back to the Millers," he said reluctantly. Ruby nodded, though part of her wished to stay in the circle of his arms. "Yes, people will talk otherwise." Wade pulled his shirt back on, wincing slightly as he moved his injured arm. "Would that be so terrible? People talking about us?" "No," Ruby admitted, helping him with the buttons. "But I'd rather give them something definite to talk about when the time is right." Wade smiled at that, understanding her meaning. "Fair enough, but I hope that time comes soon." The walk to the Miller house was quiet, both of them processing the evening's events and what they meant for their future. At the door, Wade kissed her again, briefly but with unmistakable promise. "Good night, Ruby Price." "Good night, Wade Yates." As May gave way to June, Ruby and Wade's courtship became the worst-kept secret at the Flying Y. Though they maintained propriety in public, their growing attachment was evident to everyone in the small, close-knit community. They rode together every Saturday, exploring the furthest reaches of the ranch's holdings, Wade teaching Ruby about the land and its seasons while she shared stories of her life in Boston. On one such ride in mid-June, they stopped to rest by a hidden spring where wildflowers grew in profusion. Wade spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree and produced a simple picnic from his saddlebags. "This is one of my favorite spots on the entire ranch," he told Ruby as they ate. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy, said it was where he proposed to my mother." Ruby looked around at the idyllic setting, the clear spring bubbling from rocks, the carpet of flowers, the distant views of mountains. "I can see why. It's magical." Wade set aside his plate and took her hands in his. "Ruby, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything." Ruby's heart began to race as she recognized the solemnity in his expression. "Wade, I love you, Ruby Price. I want to build a life with you here at the Flying Y." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it as my wife." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect diamond that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the cottonwood leaves. Tears filled Ruby's eyes as emotion overwhelmed her. The months of hardship after Thomas's death, the desperation that had driven her to theft in Pinyon, the unexpected second chance Wade had offered, all of it seemed to converge in this perfect moment. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Wade Yates, I will marry you." Joy blazed across Wade's face as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. When they finally parted, both were laughing and crying at once. "When?" Ruby asked, admiring the ring that fit as if it had been made for her. "As soon as you like," Wade replied. "The circuit preacher comes through Pinyon next month, or we could wait for Judge Parker's next visit if you prefer a civil ceremony." "The preacher," Ruby decided. "I'd like to be married in the schoolhouse with all the children there." Wade kissed her again, more deeply. "Whatever you want, I'm just grateful you're saying yes." They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, their happiness too great to contain. Sarah Miller burst into happy tears when they shared their news, hugging Ruby tightly before declaring that there was planning to be done. Robert Miller solemnly shook Wade's hand, then surprised everyone by pulling him into a brief, fierce embrace. News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch, met with universal approval. The children were especially delighted when Ruby announced that she would continue teaching after the wedding, with only her name changing from Miss Price to Mrs. Yates. The following weeks were a flurry of preparation. Ruby, with Sarah's help, set about readying the main house for her arrival as its new mistress. Wade insisted that she make whatever changes she wished, but Ruby found she loved the house's character just as it was, with only minor adjustments to make it more comfortable. Letters were sent to Ruby's few remaining relatives in the East, though she knew the notice was too short for any to attend. Wade had no family left, but the entire Flying Y community more than made up for it with their enthusiastic involvement in the wedding plans. Alina and the other women prepared special dishes for the celebration feast, while the men constructed additional benches for the schoolhouse and a wooden arch under which the couple would exchange their vows. The children gathered wildflowers to decorate the schoolhouse and practiced a special song to perform at the ceremony. 2 days before the wedding, as Ruby was teaching her final class as Miss Price, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Looking out the schoolhouse window, Ruby saw a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Pinyon, a wagon accompanied by several riders. Wade, who had been breaking horses in the corral nearby, rode out to meet the newcomers. Ruby called an early end to the school day, curious about the unexpected visitors. As she approached the main house where the wagon had stopped, she was astonished to hear Wade call her name. "Ruby, come quickly." She hurried forward to find Wade helping an elderly woman down from the wagon, a woman whose face was hauntingly familiar despite never having met her. "Ruby," Wade said, his face alight with surprise and joy, "this is your Aunt Harriet from Boston, and your cousins Edward and Margaret." Ruby stood frozen in shock. Aunt Harriet, but how the elderly woman stepped forward, arms outstretched. "Ruby, my dear girl, when we received your letter about the wedding, we couldn't bear to miss it. Edward arranged everything." She embraced Ruby tightly. "We've been so worried since you and Thomas left for the West. Then your letter came saying he had passed, and you were to be married again. We had to come." Tears flowed freely as Ruby introduced her surprised fiancé to her only living relatives. Aunt Harriet had practically raised Ruby after her parents' death, and cousins Edward and Margaret had been like siblings to her. "We've been searching for you since Thomas's passing," Edward explained over dinner that evening. "His parents received word of his death but had no information about you. We feared the worst until your letter arrived." "The stage was dreadful," Aunt Harriet declared, "but worth every bump and jolt to see you safe and happy, my dear." Wade, watching Ruby's joy at this reunion, seemed to grow more content by the hour. "I'm grateful you could come," he told Aunt Harriet sincerely. "Ruby has spoken of you often." Harriet studied him with shrewd eyes. "You seem a far more sensible man than Thomas was, Mr. Yates. More substance, less dreams." Aunt Harriet, Ruby protested, embarrassed. "It's the truth, dear. Thomas was a lovely boy, but his head was always in the clouds." She patted Wade's hand approvingly. "This one has his feet on the ground. You've chosen well this time." The arrival of Ruby's family added a new dimension to the wedding preparations. Aunt Harriet, despite her age, threw herself into helping with final details, while Edward and Margaret were quickly adopted by the Flying Y community. On the morning of the wedding, Sarah and Margaret helped Ruby dress in a new gown that the women of the ranch had secretly made for her, simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Aunt Harriet provided something old in the form of a lace handkerchief that had belonged to Ruby's mother, and Sarah lent a blue ribbon to weave through Ruby's upswept hair. "You look beautiful," Margaret sighed when they were finished. "Wade Yates is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Ruby replied, thinking of how different her life might have been if Wade hadn't intervened that day in Pinyon. The schoolhouse had been transformed with wildflowers, ribbons, and candles. Every resident of the Flying Y was present, along with neighbors from surrounding ranches, and even a few townspeople from Pinyon, including the baker whose bread Ruby had stolen, now an amusing anecdote rather than a painful memory. As Ruby walked toward the flower-decked arch on Edward's arm, her eyes found Wade waiting for her, his expression one of such pure happiness that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. He wore a new black suit with a crisp white shirt, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, but it was the love shining in his eyes that took Ruby's breath away. "Dearly beloved," the circuit preacher began once Ruby reached Wade's side, "we are gathered here today." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The children sang their song, voices clear and sweet in the afternoon light streaming through the schoolhouse windows. Wade and Ruby exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady despite the emotion behind the words. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, Wade gathered Ruby into his arms for a kiss that prompted cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with feasting, dancing, and countless toasts to the happiness of the newlyweds. As evening fell, lanterns were lit in the yard between the main house and the schoolhouse, creating a magical atmosphere for continued merrymaking. When it was time for the bride and groom to retire, they were escorted to the main house by a procession of well-wishers singing traditional songs and calling blessings. At the door, Wade swept Ruby into his arms to carry her over the threshold, a gesture that brought both laughter and sentimental sighs from those watching. Alone at last, in the master bedroom that would now be theirs, Wade and Ruby stood for a moment simply looking at each other, scarcely believing that they were finally husband and wife. "Mrs. Yates," Wade said softly, testing the name on his lips. "I like the sound of that," Ruby replied, stepping into his embrace. Their first night together as husband and wife was a discovery of each other, tender and passionate by turns. Ruby, who had never known such complete union with her first husband, found herself overwhelmed by the depth of connection she felt with Wade, body and soul bound together in a way that transcended physical pleasure. Afterward, lying in Wade's arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains, Ruby thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. "If I hadn't been caught stealing that bread," Wade's arms tightened around her. "If you hadn't, someone else would have caught your eye eventually. A woman like you doesn't stay alone for long." Ruby shook her head, smiling at his certainty. "I think it was meant to be us, Wade, as if all the hardship was leading me here to you and the Flying Y. Then I'm grateful for every step of your journey, difficult as it was." He kissed her forehead gently. "Though I wish I could have spared you the pain." "It brought me to you," Ruby said simply, That makes it worthwhile. The days and weeks following the wedding settled into a new rhythm. Ruby continued teaching, returning each afternoon to the main house where she gradually put her own touch on the rooms while respecting the history and character Wade valued. Aunt Harriet and Ruby's cousins stayed for a month before reluctantly returning east, promising to visit again the following year. As summer turned to fall, the Flying Y prospered under Wade's careful management. The cattle buyer returned as promised, paying top dollar for the fall herd and securing the ranch's financial stability for another year. Wade began making improvements he'd long planned, but hadn't had the capital for a larger barn, better fencing, even a small addition to the schoolhouse. Ruby threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning from Sarah and Alina about the practical aspects of managing such a large household. She started a small kitchen garden, introduced a lending library for the adults of the Flying Y, and organized a quilting circle that produced beautiful blankets for new babies and newly married couples on the ranch. In late October, as the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Ruby made a discovery that filled her with both joy and trepidation. After confirming her suspicions with a visit to the doctor in Pinon, she planned a special dinner for Wade, wanting to share the news privately before telling the rest of their extended ranch family. Alina helped her prepare all of Wade's favorite dishes, then tactfully withdrew to her own quarters, leaving the couple alone in the dining room lit by candles and warmed by the crackling fire in the hearth. "What's the occasion?" Wade asked, smiling as Ruby served the special meal. "Not that I'm complaining. Does a wife need an occasion to prepare her husband's favorite foods?" Ruby teased, her heart racing with her secret. They ate and talked about the days, events a new foal born in the stables, the progress of Frank Donovan, who was now apprenticing with the ranch accountant, letters received from Aunt Harriet and Cousin Margaret. When they had finished the apple pie Alina had made for dessert, Ruby took a deep breath and reached for Wade's hand across the table. "I do have news," she admitted. "Something wonderful." Wade's expression grew curious. "What is it, love?" "We're going to have a baby," Ruby said, watching his face intently. "In late spring, the doctor thinks." Wade went absolutely still for a heartbeat, then his face transformed with such radiant joy that Ruby's eyes filled with happy tears. "A baby." He whispered, as if saying it louder might break the spell. Then he was on his feet, circling the table to lift Ruby from her chair and spin her around gently. "We're having a baby." Ruby laughed through her tears, holding tight to his shoulders. "You're pleased, then?" Wade set her down carefully, his hands framing her face. "Please doesn't begin to describe it. There aren't words, Ruby. A child, our child." He placed a reverent hand on her still flat stomach. "I love you, both of you." The news of Ruby's pregnancy was met with delight throughout the Flying Y. Sarah immediately began knitting baby clothes, while Alina insisted on preparing special dishes to ensure Ruby and the baby received proper nourishment. The ranch hands offered congratulations with shy sincerity, many of them having watched Wade grow from boy to man, and now to prospective father. As winter settled over the ranch, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland, Ruby and Wade spent cozy evenings planning for their child's future. They converted a small room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery, with Wade himself crafting a cradle from pine harvested on the ranch. "My father made one for me," he told Ruby as he worked on it in the evenings. "It's tradition." Christmas at the Flying Y was a community celebration held in the main house, which Ruby and Alina decorated with pine boughs, red ribbons, and candles. Gifts were exchanged, Carols sung around the piano Wade had surprised Ruby with as an early Christmas present, and a feast served that rivaled their wedding celebration. As the new year of 1879 began, Ruby's pregnancy became more visible, her slender frame now softly rounded. She continued teaching, though Sarah and some of the older girls took on more responsibilities as Ruby tired more easily. Wade became increasingly protective, insisting on accompanying Ruby whenever she needed to go to Pinyon and watching her like a hawk when she moved around the house or schoolroom. Ruby found his concern touching if occasionally smothering. "The baby and I are perfectly fine," she assured him one evening as they sat before the fire, Ruby knitting a small blanket while Wade worked on ranch accounts. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know," Wade admitted, setting aside his ledger. "But women, I love having my baby is new territory for me. I can't help worrying." Ruby set down her knitting to move to his side, taking his hand and placing it on her rounded belly where their child had just kicked. "Feel that? Strong and healthy, just like his father." Wade's face softened at the movement beneath his palm. "Or her mother." As February snows gave way to March thaws and April showers, the Flying Y began preparations for spring calving and the arrival of their newest human member. Letters flew back and forth to Boston, with Aunt Harriet promising to visit once the baby was born and travel conditions improved. In early May, just as the wildflowers were beginning to carpet the meadows, Ruby went into labor during the afternoon reading lesson. Sarah, who had been helping in the schoolhouse, immediately sent for Wade and the midwife who had been staying at the ranch for the past week in anticipation of the birth. Wade arrived at the schoolhouse to find his wife being helped to their home by Sarah and Alina, her face pale but determined. "It's time," she told him, managing a smile despite her discomfort. The next 18 hours were the longest of Wade's life as he paced outside their bedroom, occasionally permitted entry by the midwife to offer Ruby encouragement and support. The entire ranch seemed to hold its breath, with ranch hands finding excuses to pass by the main house for updates, and the children gathering on the schoolhouse steps to sing songs for their beloved teacher. Finally, as dawn broke on May 6, 1879, the distinctive cry of a newborn pierced the quiet of the early morning. Wade, half asleep in a chair outside the bedroom, leapt to his feet as the midwife opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "Congratulations, Mr. Yates. You have a healthy son." Wade entered the bedroom to find Ruby propped up on pillows, her face exhausted but radiant as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the quilts made by the women's circle. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Wade, come meet your son." Trembling slightly, Wade sat beside her on the bed and peered at the small, red face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his father's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, Wade caught a glimpse of what looked like Ruby's hazel color. "He's perfect," Wade whispered, gently touching the tiny hand that immediately curled around his finger with surprising strength. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on a final choice. Ruby looked down at their son thoughtfully. "I was thinking William." "After your father." Wade's throat tightened with emotion. "William Thomas Yates," he suggested, "to honor both our pasts." "William Thomas," Ruby agreed softly. "Welcome to the Flying Y, little one." News of William's birth spread quickly through the ranch and to neighboring communities. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, and Wade proudly showed off his son to everyone who called. Letters announcing the birth were sent to Boston, with a daguerreotype of the new family enclosed that had been taken by a traveling photographer who fortuitously passed through Pinyon a week after William's arrival. Ruby recovered well from the birth, though she temporarily suspended formal teaching duties to focus on caring for William. The older girls took turns assisting with basic lessons for the younger children, supervised by Sarah, until Ruby was ready to return part-time in the late summer. William thrived, growing stronger each day and quickly becoming the center of his parents' world. Wade was an attentive father, often carrying his son as he went about his ranch duties, introducing him to horses and cattle as if the infant could understand every word. "He'll be a natural horseman," Wade predicted as William gurgled happily in his arms during a visit to the stables. "Born to the saddle, just like his old man." Ruby watched them together, her heart so full it sometimes felt it might burst. The contrast between her life now and where she had been just over a year ago still amazed her. From destitution and despair to this abundance of love and purpose, all because Wade Yates had seen something in her worth saving that day in Pinyon. In August, Aunt Harriet arrived for her promised visit, accompanied this time by both Edward and Margaret. They stayed for a month, thoroughly spoiling young William and integrating themselves into ranch life with surprising enthusiasm. "You found your place in the world, haven't you?" Aunt Harriet observed one evening as she and Ruby sat on the veranda, watching Wade demonstrate roping techniques to Edward in the yard. "This is where you belong." "Yes," Ruby agreed, cradling her sleeping son. "I never imagined this life for myself, but now I can't imagine any other." "That's how you know it's right," the older woman said wisely, "when you can't picture yourself anywhere else." As autumn painted the landscape in rich hues of gold and crimson, the Flying Y celebrated a successful cattle sale and a bountiful harvest from the expanded kitchen garden Ruby had established. The schoolhouse was full to capacity, with several new families having joined the ranch's workforce, attracted by Wade's fair treatment and the community Ruby had helped foster. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly a year after Ruby had discovered her pregnancy, she and Wade rode out to the hidden spring where he had proposed. William was securely bundled and held in his father's strong arms as they spread a blanket in the same spot as before. "I wanted to mark the occasion," Wade explained, setting the picnic basket Sarah had prepared beside them. "1 year since we learned our family would grow." Ruby smiled, taking William from him to nurse discreetly as Wade unpacked their meal. "It's been the most wonderful year of my life." Wade watched his wife and son with naked adoration. "Mine too, though I have a feeling there are many more wonderful years ahead of us." As they ate and talked, making plans for William's future and for the continued growth of the Flying Y, Ruby felt a contentment she had never known was possible. Her journey west had been filled with hardship and loss, but it had led her here to this man, this child, this community that had become her home. When it was time to return to the ranch, Wade helped Ruby to her feet, William once again secure in his father's arms. Before mounting their horses, Wade paused, looking out over his land with pride. "My father used to say that a man needs 3 things to be truly happy: land to work, a purpose to fulfill, and love to sustain him." He turned to Ruby, his eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. "Thanks to you, I have all 3 in abundance." Ruby stood on tiptoe to kiss him, their son nestled between them. "As do I, Wade, as do I." They rode back to the ranch side by side, the setting sun casting long shadows before them, illuminating the path home to the Flying Y, where a desperate act of theft had led to love, family, and a future brighter than either could have imagined when their paths crossed that fateful day in Pinyon.